is now my very great pleasure to introduce Rob Shaw, whose work, Architecture of Power, I was very privileged to proofread. And this book, and I will just explain very briefly, I've been interested in the 17th century all my life, and it got me into deeper things and deeper things. But Rob Shaw's book, Architecture of Power, completely turned my view of 17th century politics and 17th century London on their head. This book is a groundbreaker, and I'm really pleased to say that it's for sale at the back of the room. So if you haven't discovered this book, please do so. Ladies and gentlemen, Rob Shaw.
Do I just project? Oh, yeah. Thank you. There we go. So first of all, thank you, Marshall. Can I just take the opportunity to say thank you, Danielle. There's been a lot of organisation to make this happen. Thank you for making this happen. And I just wanted to say, I'll take the opportunity to pay my respects and give my thanks to the Broadstock family, who've been incredibly generous to me and really kind of changed my life in quite a profound way. So thank you to the Broadstocks. Thank you. So I'm just going to quickly introduce from my point of view, why I'm here. When Ross talks about the Lloyga not knowing their own history, that's my story. I initially got in contact with, I was looking for a copy of Moses in the Hieroglyphs by Wilson and Blackett, because I understood that they had elaborated on what Tolkien said about Welsh being a language connected with the brute migrations and so on. I heard about Moses in the Hieroglyphs, looked for a second-hand copy online, £800. I can't afford to be that curious. So I googled around and started sending messages, and within about 5 minutes, Ross got back to me and saying, I've just had the book republished today. Would you like a signed copy by the authors for £20? So I was like, yes, please. And we started, like many of you who know Ross, incredibly open and engaging human being. We started talking about Britain's hidden history. I had my narrative that I'm going to just elaborate on about 1666. And I thought I had a story. And then Ross educated me, and I think took pity on the boy Lloyga who didn't know what the hell he was talking about. So this is, I'm going to try and give you an idea of what this has meant to me, just as a preamble to me reading a bit of the book. So, I now understand that the English history of Britain begins with Julius Caesar, who so enjoyed invading this island he did it twice. In 55 BC he came here with 2 legions, it all went so brilliantly, everyone loved him so much they paid him money in tribute, and then he sailed back to France, and unfortunately he lost all the money in tribute. So then he came back the next year with 4 legions, that's 20,000 Roman soldiers, with probably 20,000 more auxiliaries. Came here, got about as far as the Thames, possibly crossed the Thames, and then it all went so brilliantly he ran away again. People loved him so much they paid him money in tribute, but again he says in his history of the Frankish Wars, I lost it all in the crossing. So Julius Caesar loved this island so much he invaded it twice. The English history of Britain states that we were literate savages before the Romans got here, this despite the fact that there were dozens and dozens of carved, stone-carved monuments in a language that's pre-Latin, what we call Colbrin, which I now understand is related to Etruscan. The English history of Britain states that St. Augustine came here in 597 and started converting the heathens to Christianity. It must have been a shock to St. Augustine to find out there were actually churches in Britain who were at least 200 years old at the time. The monk Pelagius had gone to Rome centuries before Augustine had come here and talked against the doctrine of original sin. He said, look, we're made in God's image, God created us, we shouldn't be apologising to God for what God did. His opinions were so controversial, so emancipatory, there was no original sin, that's a bad idea, was his basic argument, that he was branded the ultimate sort of Roman Catholic insult was to be a heresiarch, like someone, an arch maker of heresy. So his dangerously liberated views about Christianity were pretty much written out of history. The memory of Magnus Maximus, known in British as Maxim Vladic, was damned by the Roman Senate. They call it damnatio memoriae. If you did something sufficiently bad, the Romans would wipe you off the historical record. And it seems English history was happy to oblige with that, because no one's heard of Maxim Vladic. We're told that the Romans left us in 410 AD, and as a result of that we returned to our native savagery, painting ourselves blue, living in caves, that stereotype. And then obviously it was easy enough for the Anglo-Saxons to come into our country and take us over, because we were just a bunch of savages. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons, we are told, succeeded in dominating this island, but cunningly left very, very little evidence of it at all. DNA shows that about 70% of the white people on this island are British in origin, not Anglo-Saxon. The Roman Catholic propagandist, the monk Bede, said it was King Vortigern who first, in 449, invited the Saxons over, and somehow later invited became invaded. Whatever happened, if and when the Anglo-Saxons invaded, they did it so slowly and subtly that hardly anyone ever seemed to notice for a few hundred years. Then came the Normans, who were kind enough to return us to our native servitude and made us all serfs. Somehow we primitive savages have survived, we are told, thanks to the amazing care and attention of our aristocracy, our Norman aristocracy, who have done such a brilliant job of running this island for 1,000 years. I want to give a personal shout out to Lord Sandwich, who we're told invented the sandwich. Where would we be without these people? I'm sure if you let them, they'd say there was a Baron Beer, a Lord Wheel, a Viscount Clothes, everything's because of how great the aristocrats are. Somehow in the words of, to me, the very, very evocative song, excuse me, Yamao Hid. Thank you. According to, we are still here. No one knows who Maxim Vladic is, no one knows our history, but we are still here. And I find that a deeply, deeply moving song. I grew up, and my imagination was kind of formed by J.R.R. Tolkien, whose views on Welsh are absolutely incredible and opened my eyes to the whole Brutus narrative. His love of Welsh is why he created Middle-earth. He said so himself. He wanted to retell or recreate British stories for the English people, because we, unlike the Germans or the Scandinavians, didn't have our historical stories, traditions anymore. And J.R.R. Tolkien and all his friends were very, very anti-Norman, which, when I learned that when I was 15, I was like, oh, okay, you've got strong opinions about things that happened 1,000 years ago. I couldn't agree with him more now. So I'm going to say this. Tolkien recruited me in my youth without me even knowing what he was recruiting me to. The form of the book, the content of the book, the way it was expressed, like it does for millions of people, really, really struck a chord with me. I wasn't clear why that was. I now understand it's because he was based his writing on the power of Welsh and the power of the British language. So, I personally find more heroism and truth in The Lord of the Rings than I find facts in English history. So to 1666 and all of that. This episode is particularly instructive as it is so egregious. Crimes so huge that it's best to deny them and then slowly quieten them, edit out of history into them being accidents. Children, this is what gets me about this, children get taught this lie about the first thing they go, when they first go to primary school. Before I read from chapter 5 from Architecture of Power, I wanted to give you a brief description about what the book's about. architecture of power focuses on the London churches of a guy called Nicholas Hawksmoor, who was the only apprentice of Christopher Wren. They were built due to the Tory government's 50 Churches Act of 1711, and they remain some of the weirdest churches in the world. If you ever see a Hawksmoor church, it's not like anything you've seen anywhere else. And there are reasons for that I elaborate on in the book. The poet Ian Sinclair pointed out that if you plot these churches on a map, they make a pattern, and they do make a pattern. He called this the shape of fear, and for good measure he also said that Hawksmoor was definitely a Satanist. It seems like being a Satanist is a weird religion for someone who builds churches for a living, but that's what some people said to kind of make it make Hawksmoor more of a mysterious figure, perhaps. The conclusions I draw in the book are my attempt to understand what Hawksmoor was actually doing, and they're quite convoluted, so I'll leave that for today. Ideally I'd like to read about them. That will stay a hint. Whilst reading through Hawksmoor's correspondence, I found this opinion, which was expressed in about 1720, so about 50 years after the fire, right? And he said, London should have been made into a convenient, regular, well-built city, excellent, skillful, honest artificers made by the greatness and quantity of the work in rebuilding such a capital. But instead of these, we have no city, nor streets, nor houses, but a chaos of dirty, rotten sheds, always tumbling or taking fire, with winding, crooked passages, scarce practical lakes of mud and rills of stinking mire running through them. So he was a person whose anger about the Great Fire of London was clear in his sentence structure 50 years after it happened, and I didn't understand that at all. How could you be angry about the Great Fire of London? It was an accident. Right? I remember what my primary school teachers told me. But then slowly I began to learn more and more about his famous master. He was Christopher Wren's only apprentice. And Christopher Wren and his plan to rebuild London from scratch was ready moments after the fire happened. Wren had his plans drawn out before the fire was out. Indeed, Wren and his friends seemed eerily well prepared for the series of catastrophic events that occurred in their restoration London. Hawksmoor was born in 1661, so it was only 5 when the fire happened, right? And so was a generation younger and charged with picking up the pieces of what Wren had started. For more about Hawksmoor, please refer to the book, I will beg. I'm here to beg. So today I'm just going to read a bit from chapter 5 to give you a flavour of part of the book. This thing, fire, famine, war, disease. If you don't believe that God was responsible, who was? There's a guy called John Dryden, who was the poet laureate at the time. He got paid to write a poem called The Year of Miracles. So people were told, oh, this was just a series of miracles. The plague hit was a miracle, the fire hit was a miracle. God's doing. The point I'd like to make is I don't believe in miracles. So here we go, this is chapter 5. I should again thank Ross for coming up with an awesome title, Architecture of Power. That was his idea. It's full of Ross's illustrations, and without him and Marshall I wouldn't be an author. So I'm very, very happy to be here. Chapter 5, Fire, War, Disease and Famine. So it starts. Every child in England learns that in 1666 a fire started on Saturday night in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane, accidentally burning down the city. What is weird about reading accounts from the time is that no one in London believed that. Edward Hyde, the Lord Chancellor, reported to King Charles II that by the Monday, so it's the second day of the fire, that it was the universal conclusion of the people of London that this fire came not by chance. That's the head of the King's government reporting that to the King. But before I had read that, I came across the inscription on the monument that Christopher Wren built to the fire. And I'm going to give you, it's in Latin, I'm going to give you a bit of a translation and skip to the end. In the year of Christ 1666, on the 2nd of September, at a distance eastward from this place of 202 feet, which is the height of this column, a fire broke out in the dead of night, which by the wind blowing devoured even distant buildings and rushed, devastating through every quarter of the astonishing everyone with its swiftness and noise. It consumed 89 churches, gates, the Guildhall, public edifices, hospitals, schools, libraries, and a great number of blocks of buildings, 13,200 houses, 400 streets. Of the 26 wards, it utterly destroyed 15 and left 8 mutilated or half burned. Skipping slightly to the end of what is quite a long inscription. On the third day, when it had now altogether vanquished all human counsel and resource, at the bidding, as we may well believe, of heaven, the fatal fire stayed its course and everywhere died out. And the last line reads, "But popish frenzy, which wrought such horrors, is not yet quenched." In 1681, the monument to the Great Fire of London, the official monument, blamed Catholics for the fire. This accusation was carved in stone. You don't get more permanent than that. The official version, and then in 1830 that part of the inscription was removed. The official version of the Fire of London was changed. The official history of this country was changed, and there are lots of examples of this. How and why did that happen? Well, the vilification of Catholics, especially since the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, had become state policy. Catholics lived under draconian laws restricting their movement, their ability to practice certain professions, and even their beliefs were taxed. In these circumstances, it might have been understandable, it's easy to understand perhaps, why Londoners at the time might have blamed the Catholics. They were the go-to enemy, the go-to bogeymen, if you like. Funny thing was that they didn't believe that either. The prevailing conspiracy theory at the time was the fire was actually a result of the Dutch, and this is a story that spread almost as fast as the fire. The Dutch were fellow Protestants, and to understand why this was the overwhelming opinion of the people of London, we need to take a step back from the fire and talk about the war that was happening at the time. The Second Anglo-Dutch War and the Third Anglo-Dutch Wars were both disastrous for England, nearly destroying trade and crippling the urban economy. Both wars were started by the actions of the same man. He was a busy boy. This was one of the Stuart family's closest friends, a man called Captain Robert Holmes. Captain Holmes was one of an elite group of royalists who had joined the Stuarts in their French exile. During Cromwell's time, they'd all run off to France, and he was one of that band of brothers. As such, it is not surprising he was instrumental in fulfilling Charles II's obligation to his cousin Louis XIV of France, to start a war with the Dutch. In 1664, Holmes sailed a flotilla of ships belonging to James's Royal Africa Company to Guinea, in West Africa. So the story went, there was a mountain of gold. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that mountain never appeared, but Holmes persuaded the crew he had tricked onto the voyage that they may as well engage the nearby Dutch settlements and take their fortresses. This is how the Second Anglo-Dutch War started. The prize for the victor was domination of the spice trade. I should say at this time the English Navy all across the world, in America, in Indonesia, all across the world, 24th of June 1665, simultaneous attacks. There was a pre-planned operation by the British Navy. They took over 200 Dutch ships before the Dutch even knew what had happened. Those Dutch ships contained spices. Spices were desirable and profitable, but one spice in particular was an absolute necessity for those in the know. To understand this, we now need to take a step back from the war and talk about the disease. The bubonic plague had decimated Europe infamously in the 14th century and sporadically ever since. It killed millions over the centuries. Outbreaks were still common, especially amongst the poor. Of all the medicines then known, nutmeg was the only effective defence against plague. This is not well known. I still can't believe this. The same chemical mixture that makes nutmeg slightly psychoactive it's called mysterin. Fleas and other insects hate it. It's a natural insect repellent. You will not get bitten by any insect if you've ingested enough nutmeg. Nutmeg does irrefutably offer you some sort of effective immunity to plague. And this was well known at the time, but the information wasn't widely spread, I guess, because if everyone knew it, everyone would have wanted nutmeg and the price would have gone even higher. In the Middle Ages, the Venetians had bought the spice from Arab traders but not have found its source. In 1511, the Portuguese had identified the source of nutmeg to some islands called the Banda Islands in Indonesia. The Dutch came along, took those islands and established a monopoly on the nutmeg trade. So, the treaty that ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War in 1667, including England giving up an island in the Manor Island region, swapping it for Manhattan, which the Dutch had called New Amsterdam, but James Stuart, as Duke of York, renamed as New York after himself. Some people today laugh that the Dutch gave up New York for nothing. But that's because we never see people dying of bubonic plague anymore. Later, on the 23rd of March 1672, having been demoted, vilified and then restored to office by James, and now in command of his own squadron of ships at Portsmouth, Robert Holmes launched an unprovoked attack on the Dutch trading convoy, and this was the start of the Third Anglo-Dutch War. So this guy had, in his CV, he had started 2 wars against the Dutch. So it's fair to say Robert Holmes had fallen, he didn't like the Dutch, and I dare say the Dutch didn't like him. This antagonism between the English and the Dutch, which was nurtured by Louis XIV over control of trade generally and nutmeg in particular, resulted in wars. Returning to the year of the fire, perhaps the most famous event in Robert Holmes's career was what is known as Holmes' Bonfire. On 19th of August 1666, Holmes attacked a Dutch port, destroyed 140 Dutch merchant vessels, the biggest ever loss in their history of shipping, and set fire to a town, killing a few hundred people. It was a devastating, destructive raid on a soft-sitting target. The Dutch were outraged at an attack on a civilian town, but back in England, Holmes was a hero. He'd stuck it to the enemy. With this attack still in Londoners' minds, and the Second War was still going on at the time of the fire, when the news of the fire hit, people blamed the Dutch. Charles II had started the war with the Dutch and driven a wedge between the 2 Protestant naval powers that enabled the French to press more vigorously on land. To repeat something that's hard to believe, but it is mentioned slightly earlier in the book, this is documented history. Charles II had agreed to convert England back to Catholicism himself and the country. He took regular payments, I think about £100,000 a year in that old money, off Louis XIV, the King of France. The King of England at that time was an employee of the King of France. The Stuarts-Dutch wars were part geopolitical and part religious, and also about profiteering. As the fire raged, the story went about the Dutchman, in revenge for Holmes' bonfire, for setting fire to the city. Some said it was a Dutchman who owned the bakers in Pudding Lane, where the fire had started. In what was already a pretty xenophobic city, it became dangerous for foreigners on the streets. People with accents became victims of frenzy. Amidst the fire and smoke, some foreigners were beaten, mutilated and killed. London at that time was a tinderbox waiting to ignite. We just skip on. So, after the fire, Parliament met and said, this is the justice of God, this is the wrath of God, things like that. Samuel Pepys suffered from what we now would know or call post-traumatic stress disorder and couldn't sleep for months. He was plagued with dreams of fire. There was an MP called Andrew Marvell who was a poet, and he wrote this in 1666. War, plague and fire against us all conspire. We the war, God the plague, but who raised the fire? Who raised the fire is something lots of intelligent people were asking at the time. No town in history had ever spontaneously combusted. People at that time were sure about it. The fire had not been an accident. The rumour that Dutchmen had started was superseded by events. It is possible that King Charles II and his brother James wanted to use the Dutch narrative to deepen the divide between England and Holland. It would have suited their long-term plans and helped their cousin Louis. But there was little supporting evidence, and what evidence there was supported points to the arsonists having French and royal connections. So I'm going to now just read you from extracts from a document that I don't think many people know exists. After the fire, Parliament met, 70 MPs and Lords got together and investigated the fire. They called witnesses. They produced a report, which I'll read from you, give you extracts from in a second. Charles II had this report confiscated by the public hangman, the parliamentary report, confiscated and burnt. There are only a few copies of this report that made it out. One of them made it to America, where it ended up in the archives of the University of Michigan, which is where I found it. You can find it online. If you're interested, I'd be delighted to show anyone the link to this report. It is unbelievable reading. I tell everyone this. I thought when I was reading it, I was being pranked. I honestly thought this is a joke, someone's winding me up. But I'll really quickly give you a couple of bits straight out of this report that Charles II had burnt. Near West Smithfield, bit of London, there was a man taken in the very act of firing a house by the inhabitants and neighbours and carrying him through Smithfield to have him put before a justice for the fact. The King's Guard, these are the King's personal protection force, of whom Robert Holmes was a member. The King's Lifeguard, seeing this, made up to them and demanded their prisoner from them, but they refused to let him go. The King's Guard told the men, "That man is a King's servant, we will have him." And the crowd refused. Thereupon they drew their pistols and swords and removed this arsonist from the crowd by force. In the time of another entry, in the time of the fire, a constable took a Frenchman firing a house, seizing on him and going to a magistrate with him. He met His Royal Highness the Duke of York, who asked the reason for the tumult. One told him that the Frenchman had been taken in the act of firing a house. His Highness said, "Who would attest to it?" The constable said, "I took him in the act, I will attest to it." The Duke asked, the Duke then took the man went over to the man, spoke to him in French, took him into custody and said, "I will secure him." But he was heard of no more. And right at the end, very near the end of this report, there is this entry. On Monday the 3rd of September, there was a Frenchman taken firing a house, and upon searching him, fireballs were found, incendiary devices were found. At which time 4 of the lifeguards rescued the Frenchman and took him away from the people after their usual manner in the whole time of the fire. Now, that's in bold, that bit, as is the usual manner in the whole time of the fire. The parliamentary report put that bit in bold. They were saying the lifeguard were regularly rescuing arsonists, and there are more instances of this happening in the full report, which I'd be delighted to share with anyone who's interested. The report explicitly states the King's Lifeguard was systematically protecting arsonists. These were the same men, the lifeguard, who had accompanied the Stuart brothers in France, their ultra-loyal supporters, who would later get renamed the Home Guard. Now, would members of Parliament conspire to create false testimony about this? What kind of crazy... Why would they do that? That would have been a very brave thing to do, because if you said something against the King or his government, that's sedition. Sedition can get you hung, drawn and quartered. So you're talking about 70 MPs and lords who are either telling the truth or so committed to a conspiracy theory they're willing to be hung, drawn and quartered for it, which I've never met a politician that brave. They seem... most damning about this report is no one's ever heard of it. It's not mentioned in any histories. The facts are deliberately ignored, and the history of this incident is hidden. It's all a bit embarrassing for the future, for the king and his brother, who would become king after him, to burn down their own capital. That's just not something we include in history. History written by gentlemen, for gentlemen, if you like. Overnight, the fire roared up Cheapside, encircled the old St Paul's, which only a couple of weeks before Christopher Wren had covered in scaffolding. There was a report that was leaks in the roof of St Paul's, so this scaffolding was covered in barrels of tar. When the fire hit, it went up like a cannon. People were amazed that the old St Paul's was much bigger than the present St Paul's. It went up, the fire was so intense, the lead roof melted and ran down Ludgate Hill, like apparently there's a river of molten iron. That was a very hot fire, happened very quickly, no clear explanation except Wren's scaffolding and barrels of tar perhaps. Yeah. Sorry. So, one eyewitness, a man called John Stewart, was helping clear a library in the area called St Bride's, and he saw a grubby-looking man that he did not know. On close inspection, this stranger was wearing monk's clothes underneath his coat. Neither of them spoke to each other as they were standing in this library, which suddenly, by this man, started to burst in flames. John Stewart exclaimed, "How now, Father? It must be either you or I who fired those papers." And he grabbed hold of the man. And this man started shouting, "Passe mihi Domine," or "Spare me, Lord," in Latin. Now, not to make too cheap a joke here, but I can't help myself. Bear in mind, in the context, shouting anything in Latin would have been about as smart as shouting "Allahu Akbar" on 9/11. Like, Latin identified you as a Roman Catholic. So it's not a smart thing to say. whatever the motivation for the man to cry out in a language that identified him as an enemy, it did him no harm. After Stuart handed him over to the authorities, handed him over to James Stuart, Duke of York personally, he disappeared, like every other arsonist who was taken into custody by the lifeguards. Some testimony from one of those arsonists seems to imply that there were 23 of them that were recruited in France by a man called Stephen Headlow. That's all in the report, but you could, I certainly found it very interesting to read that report. I'd recommend it to anyone who wants to. So on Wednesday the 5th, the fire seemingly reached its destination in Brownsville Hall. Charles declared the fire an act of God. Now this meant that no one was entitled to any kind of help rebuilding the house. As a tenant, you'd have to carry on paying your rent to your landlord and rebuild your landlord's house. This meant most people in London would have been depopulated had it stood as an act of God. Understandably, this legal declaration that he made straight away, yeah, that was an accident. Great being king, you could be certain of things, I guess. Understandably, this legal declaration caused widespread dismay. The king's decision seemed calculated to wipe the city clean. London was now demoralised, deserted and destroyed. I'm going to skip on. So, Wren was right there in the eye of the storm. There's a brief summary here. It's hard to say exactly what went on, but I hope you get the general idea. The fire was deliberate. All the witnesses thought so. The rebuilding of London would create a new capital built in stone by law. This would provide a valuable recruitment opportunity and training ground for masons. And they provide possible candidates for the king's new version of Freemasonry called Scottish Rite. The city would be made anew and under royal supervision. You might know that the City of London was not part of the Domesday Book. The king was not entitled to boss people around in the city. It was a different entity. And as a result of the fire, the famine, the war and the disease, the legal status of London changed. The walls were gone, the gates were gone, he could march troops in and out whenever he liked. The war started to drive a wedge between the two Protestant powers, so Charles I could keep taking money from his cousin Louis, and eventually this antagonism would, the idea was, would move England back to the old church and the Catholic faith. In 1672, Third Anglo-Dutch War, the English attacked by sea, the French attacked by land, it devastated Holland. I think I can't speak Dutch, they called it their rampjaar, their disaster year, 1672. The English and the French colluded to destroy the only other Protestant country, and so happens to be a very, very rich country. They went in there and liberated the Dutch from their freedom. The famine and food shortages caused by the war were very predictable. There were rises in food prices and coal prices. Everything got much more expensive in London. It was hit by famine and plague and fire during the war. People were not having a good time. Now, the plague, as I've pointed out, you could buy immunity to. Nutmeg was the most expensive commodity in the world, for good reason. I'd pay a lot of money if it meant I don't die of bubonic plague, right? One of Christopher Wren's best friend, maybe intimate friend, certainly childhood friend, and they were bonded their whole life, was a scientist called Robert Hooke. Now, Robert Hooke was the world's leading expert on fleas. And if you haven't seen it, it's not going to read here. Robert Hooke kept fleas, studied fleas, knew all about fleas, and famously drew an incredibly detailed picture of a flea and published that in his book called Micrographia, which is a book of observations through a microscope. Between Christopher Wren, who had plans drawn already for a burnt London, he'd actually spent the previous year in Paris at the court of Louis XIV, learning how they were rebuilding Paris. He came back, started drawing up plans for a new London, which then burned down. His best friend was the world's top expert on fleas. And so it goes on. At the time, I'll probably end with this, try and stop rambling. Thank you for listening. But Robert Hooke was a member of the Royal Society. Now, as a member of the Royal Society, you're entitled to display your portrait. It's how you sort of got immortalised. Now, something had happened in the Royal Society, because when Isaac Newton took over as president, he had all of Hooke's papers hidden and his portrait destroyed. That has never happened before in the history of the Royal Society. You don't burn another man's portrait. That's kind of like wiping him out of history. That damnatio memoriae I spoke about earlier. For a long time you could not find anything written about Robert Hooke. His legacy is now being revived, and if you look at him and look at Christopher Wren and look at their lives and look at their work, I put it to you, you cannot say what they were up to was all coincidentally ready just as these disasters struck. The idea of, if you think about it like an actuary, if you're told your insurance company, oh yeah, well, I live in a town and it got burnt down by in a way that never happened before. The plague that hit London, no epidemiologist can explain. They can explain other outbreaks of plague. It was incredibly localised and incredibly intense and then disappeared. The fire, the famine, the war and the disease, you can all put down either to miracle, like John Dryden did, saying it's God. I would suggest to you that well, certainly I don't believe in miracles, and there were people in London at the time who didn't believe in miracles either. They were very clear something very, very strange was going on. And part of what I do is talk about, for example, Sir Patience Ward, Lord Mayor of London, who said the fire was arson. John Tillotson, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury, said the Great Fire of London was arson. Gilbert Bennet, Bishop of Salisbury, Great Fire of London was arson. The Duke of Monmouth, who was one of Charles II's illegitimate sons, Great Fire of London was arson. Huge numbers of people, clever people, including the 70 MPs and lords who drafted the report I'm happy to link you to, all said the fire was arson. Those are people there, not the primary school teacher who's reading a book probably printed in the 60s. So, to end, if you don't believe that God was responsible, who was? In my book I put it to you that all of those events are much more, well, without divine intervention it's very hard to explain those events unless you take into consideration the actions and the motivations of the restored Stuart family, whose father had been executed in 1649, Cromwell cut his head off, they'd had to live 10 years in exile, they came back to London, which suffered a series of miraculous disasters, and I put it to you, I'm going to try and stop now. It was either miracles or it wasn't, and if you read this I'd like to think I could persuade you at least to begin to doubt the fact that it was miracles. It's much more likely it was a result of human action. So many people say that to me. So this lady here says nothing's really changed, has it? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Maori. Oh yeah. Well, there are other historical incidents we could talk about where, yeah. Thank you.